Aaron and I were working on the plank here. We got the top edge smoothed off, and then we got it clamped onto the hull. Got everything dolphinited. It all looked great. We started to fasten it off. We started at the stem and went towards the stern. And we got to this point here where the sawn frame is, and I went to drill this hole for a screw, and the counterbore just got a little bit into the surface of the wood here, and the thing snapped. It just went off like a gunshot. So what we're gonna have to do now is scarf in a new piece here onto the boat. So I'm hoping that I can leave these rivets here, be able to unclamp this and get enough in here that I can cut the scarf, fit a new piece onto it, and we'll glue it here on the boat. We'll have to put the heat pads on it overnight, which means that Akiva and I will probably be spending a night in the boathouse, because I really don't like having things in here and running overnight, especially things like heat pads. Alrighty, I guess let's do some scarfing on the boat. So, I'm sure there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but this is my method. Based on virtually nothing except for my experience woodworking and breaking and fixing things. So, this all fits really well, and we want to recreate the shape, but I'm going to have to cut a scarf back in here somewhere. So what I'm going to do, so that we can use the tip of this as a pattern, even though I'm going to have to hack a bunch of this off, is I'm just going to draw a straight line on here. It doesn't really even matter where, just that it's a straight line. We have a straight line that goes through the break, and it goes farther forward than where I'm going to cut for the scarf. So when I go to cut for the scarf, I got to come past the break, which looks around here somewhere, and then I'm going to have to cut in the taper. So we're going to end up back here somewhere. And all of that's going to disappear. And what I need to be able to do is line it back up with the rest of this. And that's where this straight line comes in. So I can put 2 inches on my mark there, and then I can come out here to 34, and I can span whatever gap is in the middle there and make it up. And that'll help me put this back on the plank and use it as a reference mark and get all of that figured out. I'll be able to pick the bevels back up on it. Now that I got that marked on there, Aaron's going to take this onto the plank and go find some suitable cedar and get it thicknessed and roughed out and get the taper cut on the end for the scarf. I'm going to work on cutting the scarf here, and then we'll be able to do some more final fitting and join those together. So I pulled the rivets here so I could spring this out a bit. Got this smoothed out and got our 12-to-1. So Aaron made this one up for me. And once we had this out of the jig, we used that to match up here and get everything lined up really well. So we got the scarf all nice and neat here, and we got the bevel on the bottom. And this is all looking like it's going to line up pretty well. And I got my mark put in here. And I didn't have much to play with on this side, so what I did is I measured up at 34, and it was 2 inches. So I put 2 inches up, 34 here, 2 inches up from the bottom. And that's as far as my straight edge ended. What that allowed me to do is put this piece in here, strike the straight edge on it, and have reference marks. So come back down here. You can see I've got 24 here right at the break. I've got 30. I've got 34, but my ruler was only 36 inches long. So I made 34 also 12, and then 14, 20, and 26. And this let me take my little square here, and I could square up from 26 and pull a measurement, do the same thing at 20. I could square down to where the bottom of the angle here is and measure over from 20. And what that let me do I don't know if you're gonna be able to really see them, but I transferred them all over here. So I have the height at the 24-inch mark, I have the height at the 30, I have the 34, I've got my 14, and this is where I reset it. I go to the 20, 26, I marked back and squared down, connected the dots for the end. So now all I need to do is take this over to the bench and spring a batten from where the top edge of the plank hits here to where the plank meets back here, and then to my marks that I pulled. And I should be able to cut this out, put it right back where it was, and use the straight edge to line all that up. Glue it here on the boat, and it should be a very, very, very close to final fit. Well, I really hope that this goes in this try. So I'm sure some of you have noticed as we put in this last plank, if you were paying attention, that we have a new fastener choice. And we put in these zinc-plated steel bolts. And these are temporary, cannot emphasize that enough. They're very much temporary. And what they are for is on the inside of the hull, there's a bilge band. And the bilge band is supposed to be, I think it's something like 1x3s. So we have a 1x3 of oak here. And they run fore and aft, and they get attached to the frames. And it's just adding another stiffener, and they get bent in at a little bit different angle and pattern than the planking. So if anything wants to move fore and aft, they kind of end up fighting each other. So they're a very important structural member in this hull. And the rivets pose a little bit of a problem with that. So if we were to rivet fasten the hull and then go to put the bilge bands in, they would sit and they would rock on these rivets, and they wouldn't sit very nicely. So one thing I've seen people do is they'll put the bilge band in, they'll hit it, and then it will mark where the rivets are, and they'll take like a Dremel and just make a little divot so that it sits flush around the rivets, and then you can fasten it down to the frames. But one of the issues with that is you can no longer have access to the back of the rivet. So if it needs to be replaced, you kind of got to grind it off on the outside and nip it and just leave it in the frame, or you got to pull off the bilge bands, none of which are really ideal. Another thing we could do is screw fasten the planking in this section and then screw fasten the bilge bands. That would probably be the quickest solution. But if we do that, we're literally putting twice as many holes in the frames through this section. And as we said before, the copper rivets are really great because they join these frames together very nicely. So our idea, I've never seen this done before, but I don't see why it wouldn't work, is we are going to bolt all these planks in that land where the bilge bands are with these steel carriage bolts for now. And once we get the rest of the planking on, these molds can come out. We'll steam bend in the rest of the frames where these molds are currently blocking. And then when we go to put the bilge bands in, we'll take our bilge band material, we'll figure out where it's going to land, and we'll just push these bolts down so that they're flush with the frames. And then we can put our bilge band in. When we get it where we want it, we'll pull those fasteners one by one, drill through the bilge band, and put in a longer rivet. And then we will rivet our planks to our frames and right through our bilge bands and lock that all really well with these beefy rivets that we have. And then down the road, if anybody needs to replace a plank, or if we need to replace a plank, we can come out on the inside and grind them off where they go over the bilge bands, punch them through, and we can leave the bilge bands intact while we replace a plank or do whatever we need to do. So it's a bit more time consuming for sure, but I think in the end it's going to work out really well. So that is what these steel fasteners are about. Don't worry, we are going to take them out. They are temporary, and that is the logic behind the madness. So yeah, well, we'll find out how all that goes when we get there. So I got the new piece scarfed on, and we gave it 2 full days to cure. Wanted to make just super sure that that glue was nice and solid. And then today we set it up with the steamer, and we got it just after the glue because I really don't want to heat up the epoxy. And we're going to give this 45 minutes or so, an hour, and then see if we can bend it in and see how it behaves. We'll see how it goes. Time will tell. Yeah, that's all right. They're going to get fared in a whole bunch when we put the bilge bands in anyways.
One more. 16th away still. Yep. Touching.
Okay. Woohoo! Steamed in. Everything
done.
looks okay. But it looked okay on the last one too. And then we drilled it and it exploded.
But we didn't steam it.
We didn't steam it, no.
How does it go from here? We're just gonna sit there for a little bit and then we're gonna fit it and fasten it as quick as possible.
That's my plan, yeah. So I think we leave it today and don't mess with it.
Okay.
And I think we leave it tonight and don't mess with it. And you and I can just focus on that other plank.
Okay.
And get cranking on that. And the other million small menial tasks that I always need doing. Fingers crossed this one behaves well. Last night I dreamt that the boat was in some rough seas and one of the cedar planks blew and the thing sank, and it's not the kind of dreams I want to be having, not the kind of worries I want to have. So we've been hemming and hawing and going back and forth about options, and we've already got some cedar on the boat, but I think we're going to pull those cedars off and we're going to go back to oak, and we're going to bring it up to the water line in oak. So let's close our eyes and imagine that Arabella's done. She's on the water and we're cruising up some river. Maybe we're in some big estuary. There's been some heavier rains elsewhere. Maybe some trees, some logs, something are in the water. And we're going along and bam, you run into something. And that's basically what we're trying to recreate here. So we've got a chunk of cedar plank that's perfectly clear, and we've got a chunk of oak plank here that's perfectly clear. This is roughly our frame spacing, roughly the size of a bent frame, and these boards are exactly the size that the planking is going to be. So I want to imagine that we're going along, and the sledgehammer here is that log, that small shipping container, that little growler of ice, I don't know, whatever it is that you're going to bump into. And I know this isn't totally scientific, but I think it's going to show us kind of the real difference between the oak and the cedar. So I'm going to give this oak board a really good whack and see what happens, and then we'll give the cedar one and see if there's much of a difference. So, oak doesn't seem to care. Try the cedar. There we go. The cedar snapped right across. I don't know how long we'd have to wail on this thing to break that oak plank, but so far I've barely dented it, and there's not a single crack forming. So I think we can figure out the weight. We can do some things with the interior, with the deck, putting on a hollow mast, a few other things like that, where we can try to shave some of the weight and make up for the difference for the oak. But man, when we're in some wild and remote places, I think I'm gonna sleep a heck of a lot better knowing that there's oak down there, and that if we bump into something, it's gonna be this instead of this. So if Arabella was intended to day sail around the harbor, do some booze cruising, maybe bum around some warm tropical spots in the Caribbean, I wouldn't be too worried. But I really want to go to Baffin Island and fjords of Norway and Patagonia and some other pretty wild places. And the chances of bumping into something in the water are somewhat higher there. And I really would hate to have one of those cedar planks stove in and the boat to go down. And the weight really is an issue, but I think it's a surmountable one. And in terms of ease of hanging cedar and oak, honestly, we were going faster with the oak. So might as well go back to it. So these top two planks are going, and we're gonna replace them with oak. It's gonna be an oak on oak on oak boat. How's it feel to be taking fasteners out of the hull?
Feels bad.
According to Atkin, Arabella here should be planked in a white cedar. So he doesn't specify whether that is Atlantic white cedar or northern white cedar. There's not a gigantic difference between the two, to be honest. So we looked for some white cedar. We managed to come up with a few logs. Thank you, Dick, for those. I mean, more than a few logs. And it was not enough to plank the whole boat in cedar. So our plan was to do some lower oak planks and then get a little bit up towards the waterline, switch over to the cedar. And the real big reasons for that is, one, that the plan calls for cedar, and oak is a lot heavier than cedar. It's twice as heavy when it's dry, and it's even more than that when they're both green and waterlogged. So if we were to plank the whole hull in oak, we would be talking about adding a significant amount of weight to the hull, which is problematic because the boat's designed to float on a waterline, and you add a bunch of weight, you start to run into issues. So we finally sat down and crunched the numbers on what the oak would weigh, you know, just a rough idea compared to the cedar. And we came up with somewhere between 500 and 700 pound difference, depending on how wet we think it's gonna get and all of that. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly how many cubic feet of planking is on the boat here. But say it's 700 pounds, we think that's being a bit generous. The boat should have 2,500 to 3,000 pounds of internal ballast, depending on how heavy our ballast keel turned out to be. If we figure that we add, say, 700 pounds of oak, and we add maybe 200 pounds for the heavier copper rivets, and we add 100 pounds for the bronze straps we put in, and we add 500 pounds for the bronze floors, which I think is being generous with all of that. I don't think the floors added 500 pounds. I don't think the straps add up to 100, and I don't think the rivets are 200 pounds extra. Like, these are definitely high numbers. We come up with 1,500 pounds. So even if we're lowballing it, which I don't think we are, and we add 2,000 pounds to the boat, we still should have 500 to 1,000 pounds of internal ballast to put in here. The nice thing though is we have absolute perfect patterns for the oak that we're going to put in here, and we're just going to take it from oak to the water line. We have the oak, and then we can switch over to the really nice cedar, and we can put the really nice cedar up at the top sides, and we don't have to worry about bumping into things with it up there. It doesn't have as much twist to deal with, and if one of those planks does give up the ghost someday, it is not as catastrophic as having it below the water line. Let's nerd out a little bit here. We can see here the dry weight of oak is about 47 pounds a cubic foot, and the dry weight of cedar is about 24 pounds a cubic foot. And wet oak is heavier than wet cedar, so that number is even going to go up a bit more. And if we look at the hardness, and the way they measure this is they take a 0.444 inch diameter steel ball and they press it down into the surface of the timber. And the ball has to disappear halfway into the timber, and they'll see how much force that takes. So for oak, it's 1,350 pounds. And for cedar, it's 350. So the oak is it's much harder, it's much more resistant to denting. Same thing if we go to the modulars of rupture, which is the force to break it, 14,830 versus 6,800, so easily twice as strong there to break it. And then its elasticity, so how much it will bend under a given force. The oak is 1,760,000, and the cedar is 930,000. And the crushing compressive strength of oak is 7,370 versus it for cedar at 4,700. So as we can see, the oak, by any metric, is much harder, much denser, much tougher than the cedar. And having that much tougher, denser, harder wood below the surface is, I think, is a very good thing, especially for the things that we plan to go do with Arabella and the places we plan to go. I don't think she's going to be a boat that just day sails around the harbor and leads a very pretty easy life. Like, we want to go to some pretty wild places and do some pretty wild things, and chances are she's going to get beat up in that process. And having those tougher planks down below where it really matters, I think is going to be really important, and I think is worth kind of losing the work that we've done and taking off these 3 cedar planks and replacing them with some oak and going a bit higher. Well, unfortunately, we had to pull these cedar planks off. They were just not up to snuff. And that means that we had to go through and drill out and pound out all of the rivets that we put these planks on with. And in the process, we end up making all of these useless rivets for us because now they are too short to be put back into the boat. So we've got about 100 of these, and we want to try to make some lemonade out of these lemons. So a lot of people have asked where they can get one of these homemade copper rivets of ours, and we weren't really interested in selling them because obviously we need them for the boat. But now we have 100 of these that were installed in the boat. They went through the cedar planks, they went through the oak frames, they were peened over, and when we decided to pull the cedar off, we ended up ripping all of these out. So we're going to throw these up on the website for sale. So if you want an Acorn to Arabella rivet, there's going to be 100 of these that were actually installed in the boat. And get them while supplies last, because hopefully we're not going to be ripping any more planks off the boat. The oak seems much, much better, and they should be able to stay on.